Hello, and welcome to ImpactoAZ, a podcast dedicated to centering Latinx voices on the important issues of the day. I'm Jonathan Higuera, your host, and I'm here along with my co host, Juan Rodriguez. Welcome, Juan.
Hello, hello.
We're here today with our special guest, Gilbert Bailón, who is the new Deputy Director of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and a high-level news executive for the majority of his career at outlets such as the Dallas Morning News, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Chicago Public Media, KERA in Dallas. So he is really one of the few Latinos who really has ascended to the heights of legacy media, and he's here to share with us some of his views on life now at a nonprofit and his thoughts on legacy media and the role journalism is playing in today's society. So welcome, Gilbert.
Thank you both. I appreciate you taking time to talk.
It's so good to have you. And let's start out with that since I mentioned NAHJ, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, which I must say I have a great deal of gratitude for that organization. It has helped me in numerous ways with my career, helping me to get jobs, helping me to improve my skills, and giving me just a great support network throughout my own journalism career. So it's good to have someone of your high-level experience working with them. And tell us what you're going to be doing with them and what you're doing with them now and what we can expect out of that organization going forward.
Sure. National Association of Hispanic Journalists has been around since 1984. It was created to help train, recruit, advocate for journalists and journalism of Latino backgrounds. In the United States, also Puerto Rico, we also have some members from internationally, but primarily that's the area we serve. Our goal is to really ultimately train the journalists so it improves our society and our democracies. So we have better journalism, we have better informed voters, people, taxpayers, community members, and Latinos, as you probably are aware, sometimes are forgotten or invisible or voices aren't heard. So what we're trying to do, not just to cover Latinos, but to cover issues that impact Latinos and everybody else. And certainly there are any number of headlines right now that are Latino oriented, have focus, and sometimes if we don't report those correctly with accuracy or the right sources, it can distort or sometimes neglect to cover key issues. And so that's our primary basis. But we want to be complete journalists. Our members work in every kind of medium you can think of. It's newspapers, radio, television, podcasts, online, public media. Many have now, are like yourself, have branched out and are working in independent journalists as well, which is a really growing area, giving that local touch that the big legacy media can't, and on surfacing voices that probably either were forgotten or maybe not heard from as much. So that has also changed how we're training journalists, because when I came up 40 some years ago, it was much different. It was much more controlled by legacy media. Now anybody with a camera, social media and others can influence people. So that's how we've changed. But we still also are feeding to, like, an election cycle now. What are the big companies doing? How can we not influence, how can we educate people about what the roles are, how the system's working? So that's a big part, but it's also fun. It's to elevate the Latino culture. We have a lot of people who do entertainment, sports, things about business, education. It's not just kind of the traditional Latino issues, which are still very important. It's everything in America, because we are part of America. So that's what our goal is. My job is multifaceted. I'm trying to support many things, programs, and we have a conference coming up in New Orleans. We do an annual conference, but we also do many things like webinars, training sessions. Students are a big focus right now because we're trying to feed that pipeline of Latino journalists. So all those things are factors that we're working on, but also training our professionals, how to do the craft, how to learn how to tell better stories, work across multimedia, how to become better sourced. So all those things are part of what we're doing, and that's part of what I'm doing. What I wanted to get involved with this is because it's been a huge part of my career for more than 4 decades. Also to use that newsroom experience to infuse it, integrate it with the nonprofit work that we're doing as well, whether it's raising money or also, working with universities, working with students, working with professional chapters. We have almost 40 chapters around the country. So a lot of this work can happen in places like Phoenix, Houston, Minneapolis, wherever it might be, Chicago, where I was before. So on the grounds is very important. Although we're a national organization, we try to be regional and local too.
And you mentioned the growth of independent journalism, and you're absolutely right that anyone with a camera, with a little know-how on how to get a channel on YouTube or use social media in a proficient manner can become an influencer out there. But in my mind, I'm also thinking now many of us, many citizen journalists, as you might call them, maybe they don't have that journalism training or background. They didn't go through a school for that to be trained, or didn't work at legacy media either, where maybe there were standards and ethics that you had to abide by to be employed. Doesn't mean that they're not doing a great job, but is NHA concerned at all that or think there's a role to play to make sure that everybody, has some basic understanding of ethics and guidelines and how to be a journalist, and as opposed to just an influencer without any of that?
Yeah, there's different the platforms are used in different ways. Some people are trying to relate information, convey information, report, investigate. Others are more opinionated or a celebrity. And what our group is doing is going to be more of news gathering, but not all hard news. I mean, there are many facets of life that people want to know about. They want to know about their communities. I do think what we're trying to do is train people. How do you gather that information? How do you go out and glean it? And there's a lot of government resistance to getting information. So we're also training our people how do you interpret things, not from a political sense, but more of how do we know where's the money going? Why? How is the schools being funded? How are the streets being funded? How do these politicians and other public policies affect us? That's a big part. But I also think that we also need to see this as a vehicle for what it is. Is that this is a way to reach more people in different ways. Well, not everybody's doing journalism. Our role is journalism. That means checking facts, having some balance. It doesn't mean you can't have opinions, but opinions are clearly denoted from, hey, I gathered this information. And that's what we're trying to do with the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and Journalists, but there are many other facets to media nowadays.
Right, and I'm thinking, without that employer providing that, biweekly paycheck, perhaps some advertiser or sponsor pays you something to promote their shampoo or whatever the product may be, their services, and knowing how to distinguish, is there a firewall between what I'm reporting on and what the information I'm sharing and this sponsor or advertiser who wants me to promote something,
Yeah,
you know?
transparency is important if in fact you have to denote advertising. Then, if, for a journalist, from a journalist standpoint, that should not affect people who are doing journalism. It is not what we're trying to do. But there are things that are sponsored, and sometimes it's labeled that way. Our view is we want to be able to get good information to people, and that's getting harder and harder. Another trend that's happening while that's going on with more independent media, there's also the shrinkage of legacy media, particularly in newspapers, even in some broadcast areas where rural areas, smaller areas, reservations, others have less and less media, and that's a troublesome to us because it is such a lubricant for information and thinking around our country. We have pockets, they call them news deserts, as newspapers fold, or that radio station that can't support itself anymore. That is one of our biggest concerns because these also affect Latinos, but affects everybody. And I think this is something that we're trying to fill ways for people who may not have been journalists can also do local reporting. They don't necessarily have to have gone to a journalism school or worked at a big newspaper or a big television station to still have a community impact. And that's something we do want to support. That is journalism.
Okay. Now, we always ask our guests to share with us kind of their origin story, what where they're from, where they were born, where they were raised, what are some of the big events in life that pointed them to the career they're in. So we want to do the same thing with you. But before we do that, I wanted to just, since we have a second here, I wanted to acknowledge some of the top journalists NAHJ has as members and that they have spawned. And these folks have been my heroes for so many years. I wanted to just shout out a few names, thinking about them here. I'm thinking of Juan Gonzalez, who is now a co-host for Democracy Now, but who had a wonderful career at the New York Daily News as a columnist and as a former NHA president. People like Ray Suarez, who one time hosted Talk of the Nation. These are people who just had a big impact on me and my as a young journalist who I looked up to, and who who really were there. John Quinones with ABC News. Everybody knows John. Maria Elena Salinas, who also recently received the Walter Cronkite Award, along with Jorge Ramos. So those are the folks that I think about. When I think of NHA, I think of this who's who, Maria Hinojosa, who is doing a wonderful job in public radio and NPR, and well, with her own outlet. So and the list goes on and on. I could sit here and just kind of think of names, and I didn't name nearly enough right now, but these are all well-known journalists who have contributed so much to the field and have been mentors and heroes for those of us coming up in the field. So, any other names we should throw out there? Gilbert, you would be on that list too, but you're on our show right now, so
Well, you named an all-star team there. There's no doubt, and there are many others. Mentoring is a really important part of NHJ and just the day-to-day life of developing new news people. So it's all of us have. So, but my quick background, I grew up in Tempe, right there at Arizona State. My mom was a professor there at Arizona State, so I have Arizona roots. Still have some family back there. Haven't lived there since I went to U of A, though. I know that's not popular in
down
Tempe, but
south,
that's
that's okay. That's another
the
university. Yeah,
journalism school there. Back in the day, that was more of a newspaper school, and now Cronkite School is a behemoth. It wasn't that way back then, so it
right.
does everything. But probably would have stayed home if I was growing up nowadays. But that was my influence. My mother was an education professor who specialized in bilingual ed and reading specialization. So people who had difficulty reading, she taught bilingual. So it had an influence both of me as a journalist as well as somebody who just took up reading and writing. That was my early passion from high school when I was the news, editor all the way through college. And then I got propelled into it at a very early age, and probably even in middle school, I was writing at the school newspaper. So I had a fascination with writing. I had a fascination with communication. Back then, when I first started, I liked sports, and then I moved to news. Something I've always done. I still am a huge news consumer and always will be. I mean, that's just part of our family. That it was a time when we subscribed to 3 newspapers back when that sounds crazy now, but all of them local. So it was like I grew up in that environment. Now there's a whole bunch of other places to get news from, not just newspapers. So that was
Absolutely.
my influence. I mean, my mentors coming up, there were a number of them, but I think the people that I really envied and wanted to be like was the gang at the LA Times when they won the Pulitzer Prize back, the Frank Del Olmo and others who they were really trailblazing on a national level
Frank
and breaking.
Sotomayor. We should
Frank
add Frank
Sotomayor,
Sotomayor.
another and George Ramos and many others. There's a whole slew of people, and so all those that was where being in Arizona that had a great influence. Saying, "Wow, these guys are breaking through." There's been many since then, but there weren't as many back then. And I became an executive editor at the Dallas Morning News and the St. Louis Post Dispatch, and executive editor at Chicago Public Media. There when I was coming up, there weren't very many people. One of my big concerns now, and one of the reasons I'm with NHJ, is we've actually regressed on the number of senior managers in legacy media. There are a lot of other people doing other things. As jobs have gotten tighter, as layoffs are happening, as companies are cutting back, and news deserts are being created, there are fewer and fewer top Latina editors in the country. And this is something we've got to rectify. We can, but it's something that's a big part of it's economic. It's just people are leaving the business or the business is leaving them. So we've got to be able to have that influence to make the calls. And I think that's one of the reasons, one of my pet projects is working with management to try to get those senior level people, the middle managers, people to think about the influence, not just being on the camera, not just getting the bylines, which are very important, but it's also making the decisions on hiring, what goes on the front page leads the newscast, leads the podcast. Because so many of the issues we talk about right now that affect Latinos directly on a national scale, many times Latinos aren't involved or very few are involved. Think about
Uh-huh.
how many nationally syndicated Latino columnists there are. Not very many. Yet we're talking about immigration. We're talking about Venezuela. We're talking about all these issues that are going the political vote. Not that nobody's doing it. It's just we don't have the influence we should have as being the largest minority group in the country. And this is something that NHJ and others, we need representation, not one political view, but just representation of Latinos.
Well, that's one of the reasons we started this podcast because, I became a YouTube watcher back, way back when COVID had a little something to do with that, I think. And just realizing I didn't see enough Latino commentators on these very important issues of the day. and I didn't see it getting any better. I thought, "Oh, well, it's gonna improve because our population is exploding. It's bound to improve," but, it didn't seem to work that way, and so, we wanted to create something where people like you could come on our show and share information. Usually, we're driven by a news topic when we do our podcast, so we try and find a person who fits that topic, but I think this discussion on media is pretty appropriate for the current environment. But what I hear you saying also is that legacy media has shrunk in terms of sheer numbers of employees, but perhaps Latino representation at senior levels or management levels has shrunk at a higher rate than just the normal shrinkage. Is that kind of the state of affairs as I heard you say it?
Yeah, I
Or
think it is. I think there's some generational change. A lot of people who came up are no longer in the business for different reasons. We need to replenish that. I also think there's, with good cause, there's some pause from some people feeling like maybe the path isn't going to be what it used to be. Is it going to be more rocky? Is it going to be an option I want to pursue? And the answer is yes. It's just going to be very different from somebody like myself when I came up. And there was a more linear, traditional way to work your way up. And there's some of that's still true, but you can create and do things in a different way on yourself. You're not as beholden to corporate media as much as it's still important. I worked a lot for corporate. I also worked for public media. And there are some similarities in how we approach things, and there's some things that gives you some flexibility to do things differently. I also think something that is important for people who may not be journalists is that when I say about understanding Latino culture, it's the complexity within the culture, the regional differences, the language, the nationalities. I mean, South Florida is not South Texas, is not Southern California, and New Jersey is not, Seattle. And having newsrooms and Latinos who, not just Latinos, but people understand the differences, because we tend to see on a national scale a lot of either stereotyping or generalizations made. And we can fight through that with good information, not as advocates, but as reporters of gathering the data, trying to explain the differences. Because I've spent a lot of time in Texas, and South Texas has changed from when it was 20 years ago. It has become more conservative Republic. I don't know if it will be this fall, but the point is, it's very different from what it was. We need the nuanced people who could understand culturally what's going on with that, politically what's going on with that. And not everybody can if you don't know that, have the right sources and the right background and understand our history, the whole anti-DEI, trying to erase history is very troubling to me. We as journalists, we're daily chronicles of history. And as we beginning to see things are wiped out or ignored, or some cases actually trying to be changed in curriculum, that's very bothersome. We need good reporting. We need accurate reporting. So we leave that legacy when we're not here for people to know really what was happening at the time. History is every day. And I think now that I look at that as a daily, you could say that it's creating the daily history for the local areas. And it very much is true. When you think you want to go back in history, look at newspapers or television, it's going to tell you it's important we have the Latinos in influence, particularly in places in the Southwest and others where it's such an integral part of society. This is not a fringe niche part of America. In many cases, like in the city of Dallas, is 42% Latino. It's the biggest population in Dallas. People don't know that, but it is. And so not the whole region, but that means that needs to be captured in all the media here. Is it being accurately? Not as much as we'd like. There's efforts. And I'm also talking about mainstream English language. Spanish language is a different animal. It's attending to different things. And I think, and mostly in a good way, but they've also had to adapt too. All these transitions are platform involved. And that's not about language. It's not about culture. It means the platforms are changing
right,
as
they're
well.
all about the numbers, right? Did this
Yeah,
headline work? How many people viewed it? What's the data show? Uh, and if we write this headline a different way, we got a little bit more of a bump in our numbers. Let me ask you, since you spent a lot of times in high-level management roles during a time when it was more traditional, and they were considered the real gatekeepers to information. Um, as you reflect on your role in some of those high level positions at some of those major outlets, what strikes you about that? Did you feel like you were a gatekeeper back then, that your decisions really shaped what was being put out to the public and shaped public opinion? Or do you feel, we mostly just tried to report the truth and let the chips fall where they may? How, Tell us a little bit about that if you can. I know, because sometimes when you work for an organization, it's hard to be as candid about stuff like that as
sure.
as when
Yeah.
you don't work for them anymore, right? But
I I didn't think consciously that, oh, we're trying to shape opinions. We're trying to get people to think a certain way. What was more about what do they need, what information, what would be hold institutions to account or inform people, things like, voter guides and just basic information on, during COVID health, things more public service oriented than trying to shape media's opinion. Now,
Mhm.
I was also an editorial page editor for 4 years. So that was a different, but it was very well documented what we were trying to do when we endorsed candidates, or I was in the St. Louis Post Dispatch when the police officer shot
Michael
Michael
Brown.
Brown in Ferguson and
Yeah,
all the unrest. And so
the
we did a lot
Ferguson
of opinion,
situation.
but it was not just about that. It was also all the periphery to that. How did he get to this point? A small suburb that became largely African American, had very poor relations with a largely white police department. We actually were a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize and won a Pulitzer Prize for photography for covering that. So we saw that as a public service of how did we get here? We would be nice to have known that before, but it's not. We didn't after that, and it's changed how that region has now viewed
And
many
how
things, not
did
just
they
news.
get there? I know I've read about it that it wasn't a very well-served community, had a lot of police run-ins between police and the community, even prior to that, and that led to that was kind of the spark that set it off. But what additional information did your reporting find on how that community found itself in that, situation?
What we had done reporting about, there's a lot of small municipalities in the St. Louis area. Some of them are dysfunctional. Some of them have very bad police departments where people were used to being jacked up by the cops for fines and arrests, and there just wasn't a real outlet. These were small, many cases, smaller municipalities didn't have a lot of scrutiny. There were, we realized and some laws were changed. That you can know the speed traps and some of the other things that they were doing, arresting people and holding them without charges. Of those kinds of, we had done that before. What has changed since that? It's been over 10 years. Is there is more African American political representation in some of these cities now that there was not before, because people are realizing that these cities have changed. While you consider it a suburb, it's not your traditional suburb. These are inner ring, very close to the city where people are. So that's what we did with that. I think, and a lot of investigative reporting. Where do the dollars go? Who's paying the police? What do the jail records show? What is the track record of the police chief and the mayor? Where are they getting their donations? All these things we would look into. So that's how we learned from that. But I think also just that's so when you talk about what we need to be doing now, that's not gone away. This is also true in rural America and small towns and other places where don't get a lot of scrutiny. You're more likely to see corruption and abuse because who's going to make the check? Now, as you see more independent journalists pop up and some people on nonprofit newsrooms, I'm seeing that this could be some of that antidote for having, you know, people being able to get away with that stuff that, lining their pockets or having, cronyism and nepotism, other things that can be seen with that. But on a national level, that's also going on. So it's
Mhm.
not just local. And I think that's the core of what we do as journalists is try to expose what's going on and affecting people's lives.
Now that's the high profile side of journalism, and I appreciate the resources an entity like the St. Louis Post-Dispatch can throw at something like that. But then there's so many people, then they're still out there that pick up the newspaper for such different reasons. I'm thinking of
Mhm,
my mom who loves
mhm.
comics. Me, I'm always looking for the sports TV schedule, and I still like reading things like Dear Caroline or Dear Abby, and getting a good recipe. So,
Yep.
do you think the news roundup is now a little bit different? I mean, obviously, I still read all about what's going on with Trump and the administration, the Iran war. I want to know local things going on, but you serve such different audiences, in that role. And was that a challenge for you, or you always loved that it was able to meet different needs with a single newspaper?
Well, it was you understood there were audiences within audiences within audiences. So that's that some things were of general interest, some things might not. It could be, not everybody's, a restaurant fan or a sports fan or movie fan, but those are all important things for many people. So I did like when I was in newspapers in particular, and to some degree also with the public media, trying to have that spread because we don't want we know there's people who are fatigued with news. So I run into people all the time, sometimes within my family or friends who says, I tune it out because it's all about murder, mayhem, and bad news and war. And I tell them that there's a lot of other things that we're doing besides that, and particularly on a local basis. If you national, international news is a different thing from what's going on in Phoenix or going on in Dallas, and I can't get that from in any large scale from the New York Times or CBS or the Atlantic or some really great institutions, but they can tell me, what's happening here with the schools or the roads being torn up or, the scoundrel
And
who
it's
might
not
be.
nearly as comprehensive as it used to be, but they still leave enough in there that it makes me subscribe. But,
Yeah. Yeah, and I do like having that kind of the buffet effect, but I do know but also how people get news because the reality is how people are consuming news. They're not necessarily going to that homepage website as we would look at. They might just get it in social media or through a newsletter. So they may not read the whole thing, but we want them to read it. We want
mhm,
them to absorb it because I appreciate it. But they may only care about business or the stock market or whatever it might be. We want to feed them as well, but they may not care so much about what's going on politically or other things. And so that makes a challenge because if as your traditional newscast or your traditional newspaper still is somewhat of an eclectic mix, and I think it'll stay, but we're also becoming much more specialized. I think that's okay as long as people get a good diet. They're not just eating all junk. They're not
mhm.
just not TikTok is I know people I get my news from TikTok. It's a little bit scary because there's a lot of stuff that's not good
What's
stuff. It's not even
verified and what's
news.
not verified,
I
right.
also realize that I can't change it from people saying that, but maybe we news organizations can put some things on that are corroborated. We can tell you the source or give you the link so you can go find out for yourself,
Yeah.
what's happening. I think
Yeah,
that's
Facebook is
a good
merely
reach.
a tip sheet for me. I mean,
Yeah.
"Oh, no, someone might have died. I better go verify it,"
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So, but I also wanna hear about well, let me give you a chance, Juan. I'm sure you might have something you wanna ask or
Well, briefly, I know we've talked about legacy media and independent media. One of the things I'm fascinated by, because I'm a podcast junkie and independent media junkie, and I listen to a lot of what may be considered independent podcasters over like the podcast news market is much different now than it was, say, 3 or 4 years ago. I'm seeing more professionalism. I'm seeing networks forming
Mhm.
among podcasters. You have Stephanie Miller, John Fugelsang, Bob Zeska on the Independent Voices Network. You have the MSW Network, and these all started as uh, journalists who were left behind
Mhm.
corporate media, or journalists who said, there's got to be a better way. You know, um, what I'm hoping to see at some point is for Latino podcasts to start forming those type of alliances or efforts. What are some of the podcasts that Latino listeners should be listening to, or independent media venues that or outlets that listeners should go to and get their news?
Yeah, clearly the mainstream media legacy has adapted to your point. So you are going to see more podcasts and
Hmm.
video casts from that. But I think on the independent side, there are a few who are active at NHJ. Uh, Jim Acosta, who, former CNN, he's got his own setup that does well. Nick Valencia used to be with CNN. He also is out there. Uh, USA is it's not independent, but it's been a trailblazer in the area of podcasts and also radio. That's Mariana, they have podcasts as well. Those are all ones and they can help kind of there's some others there's some bilingual formats that are also interesting very different. Some are music oriented, some are more cultural oriented. Um, but I do think that we need more of that. And I think to your point is right, because I think there's still going to always be somebody who's not really a journalist, but can have good, good talk. But I think there is enough journalism doing interviews and getting information that can help really educate people in a different way, not necessarily from a viewpoint. I think that's the trouble we have because podcasters across this huge array. And some people very much have a point of view, sometimes very political pointed, and they are very popular. But more from a journalistic standpoint, they would be basing either on their own reporting or doing some interviewing, integrating journalism with the podcast. I think that's the benefit we can have as Latino journalists.
Yeah,
actually,
because one of the things I'm seeing, or I'm hoping I'm seeing, is that with independent journalists. they seem to be picking up the torches left behind by legacy media and doing the work that legacy media doesn't want to do anymore.
That's
And I'm hoping that's what I'm seeing.
That's true, and I've seen a lot scattered across the country, particularly as it relates to immigration. Not all Latinos, but many of them, trying to what ICE is doing in your neighborhoods, where people are being disappeared, all these things. That is journalism. I mean, you don't have to. You don't get a license to be a journalist. They're creating news and they're tracking. You have a camera on your phone. You are become a journalist in some ways. So I'm seeing that aspect is good, but not all journalism is created equal because we have to be able to show your sources and have some
Yeah.
basic fact checking, and you can't distort, you can't use AI to twist things. That's not journalism. That's something else. That happens, but that's not what we're doing as journalists.
I think you're onto something there, Juan, though, in terms of some kind of collaboration or union of Latino podcasters. Because I've just sitting here from Phoenix, I can think of about 3 or 4 right now, fellow Latina journalists who have a podcast, and we're all doing our own thing. We kind of run into each other and say, "I support you," and I'll pay for someone's Substack subscription just to show support, but we all are out there doing our own thing. I don't
Yeah.
know if there's a way to make us a little bit more united so that all our needs are met, so that we don't feel like we're all competing for the same thing. But I think there's space for different kind of podcasts, but something to think about.
Yeah.
Although I never retain very well from listening to podcasts, I always have to back it up with reading something. But that's just how my memory works. But tell us, is NAHJ going to be offering any workshops or panels or anything on the state of podcasting and the latest and
Yeah.
greatest? What's going on there?
Yes, we have our conference will be July 22nd to the 25th in New Orleans. It's our annual conference. And we have across all kinds of media, including podcasts. There's video, there's a visual task force, there's other things, sports, AI, in addition to the more traditional journalistic skills that we have. It's a very important part. And also a lot of the students are very interested. Many of them have their own podcasts. And so the question always becomes, how can I break through? How can I get greater audience? What's the visibility? Is there a
How can I get
particular niche?
monetized?
How can I get monetized? But also and that takes getting heard. So how can I get heard to get monetized?
Yeah.
It's the classic, either whether it's a podcast or even public media, you got to build audience to get money, but you got to have, some resources to be able to get started. So I think you're right. I think we need to do a better job of just publicizing people. I don't know if people know some of the really good podcasts that are across the country. You can be anywhere. This is not necessarily a geographic thing, or it could be if it's like, hey, I'm from Phoenix. I want to know what's going on in Phoenix. I'll listen to a podcast. Or I
Mhm.
worked in Chicago. I'll listen to their podcast. Do a better job publicizing because the issues are different. They're not entirely different, but there's regional difference. There's ethnic difference. And so I think this is something we need to continue to build. And you even see it like at NPR, who I worked with before, as a liaison with them. They're doing a lot more video. So it's not just doing radio. You will see Steve Inskeep, or Mary Louise Kelly on camera talking to, the senator. So there's an idea that we need to reach different people. We can incorporate those same skills in our own, as you're doing here. You don't
Mhm.
have to be a big company and have fancy studios to do a lot of really good work. The question is, what are you bringing to the table? What's the information, the voice, the dialogue that elevates people, that's interesting or has impact? And again, I think that's the good thing about what's happening. I am concerned about mainstream media because they're the ones who typically can invest more money in doing long form investigative work, kind of things that you see all the time in national news. But we need that on a regional, local basis
Yeah.
as well.
Seems like an organization like ProPublica seems to be filling that role more and more, where
Mhm.
they're doing the deep dive investigative journalism work. Thank God they're there, but
Yeah.
I don't know anything about their finances, but they seem to be hiring. But you're always wondering. We need our institutions, our solid institutions, that continue to do that kind of thorough investigative journalism.
Well,
So.
John, to your point about creating some partnership, just thinking as an NHJ person right now, how can we support the people who do have podcasts? How can they elevate each other, share each other's work? Many have websites or are part of a news organization, and if you're talking, whatever the subject matter might be, technology, for example, that's not a Latino thing, but how does it affect Latinos? or things in Spanish that would be very specific to a community. How do we support each other with that? I think we need to develop a network of how do we share that information, because now that's how we can support each other and get that audience and begin to say, oh, there's a specialist who already knows about law, legal issues. Okay, well, that's something and this person happens to be a Latino or a political expert who's interviewing Latino candidates, that we can work more on that, because there's enough now that there's a critical mass. We need to
Right.
see how what we can do with that as Latinos. We need more, but we need to really work together.
Yeah. In doing some of my research before we launched ImpactoAZ, you'd find podcasts that were just slightly different. The missions of each one are different. And I found one on maintaining Chicano history, for example. So they're more cultural, and they go and dig out some great stories of Chicano history and present it, whether it's could be about Ruben Salazar, or it could be about the East LA blowouts back in the early 70s, just things like that. So each one brings something to the table that might be a little different than, say, what we're doing here today.
Mhm.
So, um, okay, well, wow, this is great. Well, since you were talking about your experience with NPR, KERA, I believe, right, and Chicago Public Media, tell us about that transition from doing newspaper kind of journalism, which by the time you left was multimedia as well. I know you were doing all kinds of things, but going from newspaper work to public media work. I mean, was there much of a transition there for you in doing that, or are they operate on the same principles? I know solid journalism is solid journalism, and there's a reason that people like Dan Rather worked at the Boston Globe for a year or two before he moved into his broadcast career. But you tell us your experience with that.
Yeah, well, ethically and journalistic standards were the same. People were still on the same side of, the SBJ code of ethics and how we present news and, try to minimize harm. We try to investigate all these different things. That wasn't different. The platforms are different because you think with radio, everything's time. With newspapers, it's not, the print newspaper, it's more about space. With digital, you can have either one, but it's all about how am I going to present. And also you're thinking about social media. How am I going to grab people? Am I going to break through all this stuff? And so there's some different mindsets for the same story. So technically it was different. Doing a 4-minute radio feature is very different from doing a 1,500 word print story. But they have the reporting's still there, but how you approach it and present it is different. So your mind has to wrap around it. When I was at Chicago Public Media, we actually had the Chicago Sun-Times and WBEZ radio in a merged newsroom. So we had one staff doing all of that, and that's still something they're working on. That is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity because it means you have multiple, and of course they had 2 websites. So we have multiple platforms, but how you go to market with a print newspaper in sports is not the same way you're going to do it on sports radio. So that was the difference with that. But I do think that the cornerstone of how we report factual news and fact checking, and also trying to entertain people. I think with radio, there were times we could have, like, we had a call-in show in Chicago, which could be much more free flow. You can't really do that. Most radio stations outside of true talk radio, you can't. That's not an opportunity for people to get information. And some of the topics were heavy, some were not. There was some way, what the hell weather was going on or things of that nature, but also very important things that might be about, safety on the trains, of that nature. So that is a way to engage in a different way. Digital also gives you a different way to engage because people can get it in many facets, and they're not necessarily subscribers. Sometimes there's people who happen to see it in their feed and they lop on and say, oh, this is an important story. So we see that as reaching more people. So it is different, but the journalistic opinion is not different, but how the technology and the approach can be different for that.
Now, I'm guessing that you worked at outlets that often had a bureau in Washington, D.C., or had national reporters who covered the administration, Congress, things like that. And let me just ask, how do you feel about the way the Trump administration has treated and dealt with media that is trying to cover them? Many times legacy media, but not always. But whether it's the Wall Street Journal or the Dallas Morning News or whoever's asking the question, the Los Angeles Times, just from my own viewpoint, from being an armchair observer, It sounds like it's been very disrespectful, and the rules of the game have changed immensely, bringing people into the White House press room who in past maybe didn't merit being in the White House press room, but because they're favored by the administration or seen as favored, they're allowed to have a seat at the table. I don't know. What are your thoughts on how this administration seems to be dealing with national media?
Well, antagonism to the media is a platform. That's a part of their political strategy is to undermine credibility in lots of institutions. Journalism is one of it. There's other, when you're second guessing or saying that there's various conspiracies, that's damaging. I don't know. I'm hoping that does not have a long term effect, but it's going to have an effect for a while. I can't say it's going to all go back to normal at some point because it probably won't. There is a lot of cynicism and skepticism among the public about many things, including journalists. We don't rate highly. That's been used as a political tool. I think just trying to harass, the journalists, or in many cases, equally troublesome is denying access where we don't have access. And you think of the case of what's going on in immigration, we don't know how many people have been arrested on what charges or where they're detained or where somebody was shipped to Uganda. I mean, there used to be a time where we had freedom of information. We could get the information eventually. There's a very antagonistic approach to that. That's not about journalists, but it is about transparency. And that is troubling to me. And then the things that you often see where he's just, criticizing and name calling and
Name
press
calling.
conference. We had a call the other day about when the Iranian ships were shooting at some boats in the Strait of Hormuz, and he wouldn't answer the question. That's to me that's Trump because that's not hurting journalists. It's hurting the American people. We need an open democracy where we can get answers. Because when we ask those questions, whether we're at the local school board or we're in DC, we're asking those questions and trying to get information on behalf of the public. It's not our own personal benefit for that. We want people to be informed of what's happening. And so and that also has had some effect locally. I know here in Texas, there are some of the politicians who are very antagonistic to media, unless it's, ones that are favorable to them. And I think that's a very troubling sign. But what we have to do is do our jobs. Marty Barron had a great comment back when he was at the Washington Post says, we are not at war, we are at work. And I think we got to keep doing our jobs. This is not about political fealty or strategy. It's about whatever's going on, whoever's making decisions, whether it's business, politics, or others, we need to be able to shed light on what's happening for people to make good decisions. That's going to continue to be. It's been harder under this administration, there's no doubt, because it's been more antagonistic. But, we're going to keep doing our jobs. That's what we do as journalists.
Okay. Well, I think we can start to wind down here. Juan, do you have any questions before we ask Gilbert for some final thoughts?
Not any questions per se, but I'd like to say thank you for coming in and talking to us and just giving us a wonderful insight into the state of journalism overall today, and to get to know you a little better. So thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you. So I would just say that again, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, it's based in DC, but we're all over the country. We have chapters and seminars. We just had a student summit in Orlando this last weekend, more than 100 students at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. So we're doing things all the time, and we're doing them on behalf of the community. I think people don't realize that. This is not, this is volunteer work for most of our members are doing jobs. And so we also have the conventions coming up in New Orleans, July 22nd to the 25th. Our website is nhj.org, very easy to remember. It has all the different, whether it's for students or other connections. My email is very simple. It's my last name, my G Bailón, my last name at nhj.org. If you have any feedback or tips or ideas, we're trying to serve journalists. And I think it's important that people really see what we're trying to do and not necessarily hear some of the stories or the criticisms that we have. Not that we're perfect, but we are really in the public service business. That's how I've always approached it. That's how the best journalists I know see it. It's not out of fame, glory, and money, but it is how do we serve in different ways. As the way police officers and school teachers and educators and all these other serve people, we feel we're serving the democracy. And I think it's important that people understand that in a very complex, changing world with media as well as politics.
Okay, very well said. And with that, I think we'll conclude this show. And if you enjoyed the information you received today, please like and subscribe to our channel, ImpactoAZ, so we can continue to bring you information and guests like this. So I would like to say thank you for viewing, and thank you to our guests for being here, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you.